Hope or fear? Redemption or genocide? Today we're going to discuss the 1918 and 19 Spanish flu pandemic and how the Watchtower and its various splinter groups handled the subject then, and compare it to how the Watchtower Society is discussing it today. Be sure to watch to the end because we're going to show some rare historical items and discuss the future direction of where this channel is going to.
The Golden Age. On the very first page of the very first issue, there's a discussion about the influenza virus. They had to discuss it. It was a timely matter. The Golden Age was created to try to initiate the preaching work. The preaching work had stopped for a couple of reasons, but one of the reasons it stopped was because of the influenza outbreak.
I like how they worded it, and 100 years later, the wording is the same. There are more sad hearts in the world today than any other time in history. Most of the literature keeps continuing in that fashion. Yes, the world is getting worse. There's no question about that. But the type of presentation they've given hasn't changed much along those lines since Rutherford era.
They always think now is the time that it's worse than any other time in history, and this has never happened before. Well, it didn't happen before the last time you said it didn't happen before, and the time before that.
So the events unfolding around us are making clearer than ever that we're living in the final part of the last days, undoubtedly the final part of the final part of the last days, shortly before the last day of the last days.
Sono doppia da dindo scala, nella dindo, igela boom.
Boom, yeah, I understand boom.
Bada boom.
Big.
Big.
Yeah, big bada boom.
Big. Bada big boom. Big.
Yeah.
Boom.
Yeah, big bada boom.
Bada boom.
Big boom, big bada boom.
Anyway, Tony Morris the third. Tony Morris the third.
You know, when we're facing these disasters and all these things, and I've been telling them for some time now, cheer up, it's going to get worse. And so we keep a sense of humor with it, but that's a fact. What we're experiencing right now in this global pandemic, I was telling the branch class yesterday, it doesn't bother me. We've been waiting for this.
The attitude is just appalling now. They're looking forward to death of billions.
Everyone but themselves.
Yeah.
And it's almost that attitude, well, at least it's not us. You know, when something bad happens. I mean, when I get to be saved. It's like if you were on a boat and you had the only life vest, you know, and jumped off onto a lifeboat or something. It's the same comparison. Why would you be glad the others are dying and calling them wicked, or maybe even think God liked me better, so I get to be saved? So there's so many ways to go around that subject.
But if your goal is to save all these people that you think you need to save, wouldn't you tailor your presentation so that it would be presentable and not... I think their current takes on this is just very embarrassing. It's embarrassing to watch for me, and it's embarrassing, I think, for the organization. But this New Covenant Advocate, do you know the history of that, Paul?
No, this one's new to me.
Have you ever heard of the story of Roseball Henninges?
Yes.
The little girl who sat on Russell's knee, and that's what Mariah Russell took to court.
Yes, yes.
Her and her husband, when the split happened, moved to Australia, and they started this magazine.
Oh, that's interesting.
With one of the splinter groups.
Very interesting. I never knew that. Very good.
And what's interesting, you can, I've digitized the majority of the paper, being the archivist that I am. Notice their attitude on the next slide, the new era. The attitude again is, you know, if this is something we should expect, the trouble in the world, there's something better beyond. There's good news coming. And good news even for those who disagree with us. is the basic idea that they were presenting.
And that is a key point right there. That's not going on today. It's only doom for those who are not part of their organization or follow them. So that's quite a difference in the whole philosophy of the whole movement, so to say.
I think it's a way to frighten them, to try to keep them under control. You can control people by fear. You'll notice the preaching work here didn't stop either, even under the difficult circumstances that they were in.
I thought the preaching work stopped.
It only stopped in the areas where the pandemic was the worst. So
Okay, I'll let you get into that in a little bit, but it was stated in their literature the work did stop.
We'll look at that, and then we'll compare a new Watchtower with an old watch, a century apart, and then we'll see, does the claim match. I found this October 1918 Watchtower. I found that interesting because convention at Pittsburgh canceled on account of epidemic. Notice they didn't have time to typeset it. They just created a stamp and stamped it.
You follow things more than me with them. Are they canceling conventions now?
Oh, yeah.
They are? Okay.
Yeah, I like this letter from a sister. It says, "We're having our meetings in a park now on account of the Spanish influenza. I would rather depend on the promises to the little flock than gain the whole world." And that's another difference between then and now. Then nearly everyone was striving to be part of that little flock, that heavenly class. Now, almost nobody.
Another episode.
Yes, another episode to come. This is an interesting one. It mentions the convention had canceled. Do you know what the St. Paul Enterprise was, Paul?
Yes, that was a Bible student paper. And in fact, you were the one who told me what it was quite a while ago. They formed their own paper. Elaborate on how you told me.
Basically, it was a newspaper in St. Paul, Minnesota. The editor of the paper heard a political speech by Teddy Roosevelt, who was campaigning in 1912, trying to get reelected as president. And he was talking about, we're marching towards the Battle of Armageddon, and we're going to fight for the Lord.
Now to you men who in your turn have come together to spend and be spent in the endless crusade against Rome, to you who face the future resolute and confident, to you who strive in a spirit of brotherhood for the betterment of our nation, to you who gird yourselves for this great new fight in the never-ending warfare for the good of humankind, I say in closing what in that speech I said in closing, we stand at Armageddon and we battle for the Lord.
You know, in those days, they would listen to the news events that were going on, and they would try to tailor their lessons towards that. So Charles Taze Russell made a sermon called The Battle of Armageddon. Well, the editor of the paper picked it up, looking around, what do I have? Battle of Armageddon? Well, he picked that up and put it in the paper that week. Thought it was interesting. Well, he got lots of praise for putting it in there and also lots of criticism. So he told the folks, the ones who wanted it in there, they said, please keep publishing these. He said, I'll keep publishing them if you can find me 1,000 subscribers. Well, they found 2,000 and then 3, and it grew from there. Eventually, he became a Bible student, and you'll see him around the convention circuits in the days of Charles Taze Russell. He died shortly after Rutherford became president, and then the Watchtower Society took control of the paper. But they were still very, very independent. But it's only been in recent years that we've been able to get the microfilms for the paper from the Historical Society in Minnesota, digitize them, and they didn't have the entire run, so through Watchtower Collecting Friends of Mine, we were able to fill in the gaps. We have nearly a complete run now. There's an issue here or there that's missing, but we have almost a complete run.
I think it's safe to say you probably have the largest collection of Bible student and early Jehovah's Witness material than anyone out there.
If I don't have it in physical form behind me, I have it digitally. Like,
Yeah, and there are things you have that I know nobody has. Some of the stuff you have are originals or scans that only somebody gave you after they died. So Jeff has quite a library. He gave me 1 terabyte. Part of it was a backup in case something happens and whatnot. But it's very interesting. All the early literature, books, you name it, that's on there. History, letters. It's very fascinating.
I also live very close to the Aurora University, which is a second, or I think it used to be a second Adventist university, and they have a collection of early and later William Miller and Adventist Splinter group literature. And if they don't have the original, they have it in microfilm. So I had signed my life away, some document, and I went there for years, here and there, just scanning microfilms.
And that's the other thing. Yeah, that's the other thing. Yours is a complete. Everybody else has a part of this, a part of that. You have quite a collection in one spot. So when you open up your museum, you could have it all.
So the Herald of Christ's Kingdom was another magazine by another splinter group of the Watchtower Society. This was the Pastoral Bible Institute. They mentioned that the influenza outbreak, but that the work was still continuing. Some were prevented from coming, but they still had their convention. They actually had to move from one hall to another. Part of the city was under lockdown. And we're all very aware of what lockdown is these days.
Is the Herald one of the ones still in print?
Well, the New Covenant Advocate, the New Covenant group, is still publishing magazines. They call it the New Covenant News now. The Herald of Christ's Kingdom, that's still published today as well. That personal loss slide. For me, when you see a short description of a person, it's not just a statistic. I think when you read these little stories, it makes the history real to me. And that's why I put that here. Some of the stories I just found heartbreaking.
Yeah, the Spanish influenza killed a lot of people back then. And the Bible students and early Jehovah's Witnesses were not themselves immune from it.
But they say that more died from the Spanish influenza than died in the World War which preceded it. And it affected many people on a personal basis. And so these letters in the St. Paul Enterprise were all from Watchtower subscribers. And they were writing in, telling their personal stories of loss, of how somebody close to them had died or passed away, but also how they were able still to give a message of good news or the person who died was able to give a message of good news. Basically, the preaching work continued.
It didn't stop.
It didn't stop.
Sorry, I couldn't help resisting there.
The preaching work didn't stop. Notice even the September 1st, 1923 bulletin. Do you know what the bulletin was, Paul?
Did that evolve into, what is it, the Kingdom Ministry?
Yeah, I think that's what this was part of. And so they were still using the Spanish influenza several years later as a way to preach their message. And then I put a lot of evangelical friends on my Facebook feed, some of their Facebook posts. This isn't something unique to the Watchtower. This is what Christians are commanded to do, is to preach the message. But I think it should be good news. Jesus called it good news, not a message of fear. And I think that's what the witnesses are putting out today, is a message of fear. You'll die in Armageddon unless.
But there's hope there. And that's when
it's a future episode.
And that's when you talk with one of them. They'll say, oh, no, we don't give it. Well, wait, because you say, oh, well, if you do this, then you have hope. So that's really not hope, as far as a full broad spectrum of hope for mankind. It's a narrow spectrum of hope for a select few if you follow. But now remember, we're going to be talking about, I don't want to get too much into this because we're going to be getting into other issues.
This one is interesting because it again talks about the influenza, but notice the cover story on that particular issue.
Yep. 8 Bible students released on bail. Now that at that time, at that date, that would be the whole focal point of the 1919, the new information and all that, when they were released from prison, when they were arrested for not following governmental order. It had to do a lot with the 7th volume that they say was the 7th. So go ahead, elaborate. You're the historian. Go on.
Well, this is when Rutherford and his friends were put in prison. But notice also the little political cartoon, League of Nations. And they weren't as opposed to it in 1919 as they later were. They were less politically neutral than later. And I think this prison experience of Rutherford is what changed him.
Well, it's true. Prison changes you. So, how long did he spend? It was only months, wasn't it?
I think it was 9 months or so.
9 months.
And that's not the lockdown we're talking about today.
Yeah, they were in a white collar section of it. So, but I like where it's going and where you're going to head with this one.
As politically neutral as they are now, they were not so back then.
No.
President Roosevelt passed away, and they said some very, very good things about him. But one interesting thing I didn't know, and I need to research this a little bit more, but it says the people at large have no idea how much they are indebted to the Roosevelt administration. The pestilence of Spanish influenza might have been 1,000-fold worse. So it's just nice to see praise for the government that they were living under at the time. So there's a recent Watchtower, but the claim here is that the work stopped.
What I'm thinking is in the future, if that's questioned, there'll be an explanation for it of what was really meant by the work almost stopped completely. And it'll turn into, well, probably the governing body's work stopped completely and it'll all be changed. But no, they were very active and coming out with what you wanted to do on a future episode with the 1919. This is quite a contrast because they were active, and what that 1919 philosophy states is it died. The work died. Well, if you look at as you were fortunate enough, and people are fortunate enough to have people like you to do all this research and do all that, that's not true. They were very active. There were conventions going on. There was preaching going on. Lots of stuff happening. It did not come to an end except for those 8 men in prison. And yes, if I remember correctly, they did shut down the printing presses. Am I correct on that?
Well, no, because you'll see remember that Watchtower that was published earlier, they had the stamp on it.
Mm-hmm.
You know, because of the influenza outbreak, the conventions canceled, the presses were still rolling. There were certain things they were not allowed to print, though.
Which was just basically the 7th volume and a couple of other...
Yeah, the finished mystery. So we'll get into this in a future episode. But one of the things they thought is, well, we can still distribute the finished mystery. We'll just tear out the pages the government objects to. And the government said, no.
One final comment on that highlight you have in there, the preaching work almost stopped. There are, and I have read other publications that stated just the opposite, that the work did come to a stop. So that is not an accurate statement right there. So that's 2012. And that's why I was getting with you earlier. Okay, what's it say in 2017? What's it say in 2010? Well, I'd like to look that one up. Personally now, you got me interested in that. But I have personally seen when they were trying to show the 1919 point, even in the articles and stuff you sent me, it said it completely stopped. Here it says almost.
And I think you hit the nail on the head earlier when you mentioned that when they talk about the preaching work stopped, it refers, without saying it directly, I think it refers, just like you do, to Rutherford and his co-editors that were put into prison. Their work stopped. They did, send letters out of the prison that were published, but there were other editors and writers who were able to continue the paper while they were in prison. But that preaching work didn't stop. But the other thing in summary I would say about this is just the tone of the attitude difference between how they handled talking about the topic then versus the attitude now. I think the attitude now is appalling and it's not a good example of a Christian. It's not how a Christian should act. The whole point of this is the claims that are made about 1919, one of them is that the work stopped. And one of the reasons it stopped is because of